Hi, I'm Bob the Hollow, here to talk about the first scene. And if we're going to do that, then of course we're going to be talking about Vendrick and Audia as well. And just a heads up, I changed the visual style again. I kinda had to just to get the video done and out there. And it's a long video with a lot of information in it. So just take your time with it, right? And don't forget there's English subtitles. So, without further ado, here's the lore of the first scene. If we're going to talk about Vendrick and Audia, then we should probably start at their origins. Given their obsession with dragons, I think the first, most intuitive connection would be to the Drakebloods, but I believe there's a better alternative, Pharosa. Sages and Dragon Riders, specifically, lead me to favor this kingdom as Vendrick's homeland. The sages are relevant because Soulgeyser, being a family heirloom, indicates that Vendrick and Audia's lineage was traditional of sorcerers. But there are no mentions of sorcery being of any importance to the Drakeblood Knights. In Pharosa, though, sages could become North Warders, sorcerers who led warriors into battle and served as oracles to the revered gods of war. And Vendrick's Dragon Riders form a pattern with the Nameless King's change of heart. The Nameless King, or the Sun's firstborn, is largely believed to be Faran, a Pharosan dragon-slaying god of war and patron deity of the Faran Lionites. He would have relocated here sometime after his exilement and, as I have explained in Primordial Flame, his decision to befriend the dragons also happened after his exile. But at this point, he was still considered a dragon hunter, judging by the engraving on the helms of the Faran Knights. Taking this into consideration, his transition from a dragon slayer into a dragon rider would have happened either after or simultaneously to his departure from Pharosa. He eventually settled in Archdragon Peak, where we can also find signs from the Lothric Knights. These knights have been around and involved with the gods since at least the times of the Ringed City, and since they were once hunters of dragons, they've probably existed since even before that. So it's no surprise they'd one day be reunited with Winged Firstborn. There's never an explanation to how such a mighty kingdom fell to war, but when Faran left, others may have followed suit. Such an abrupt loss to the ranks in times of war would surely have aided in the kingdom's downfall. It is said that after its fall, the people of Pharosa scattered to neighboring kingdoms and became bandits and sellswords, but there are no tales about the fate of its war gods. It's as if they just up and left one day, like Lothian, one of Pharosan's most famed warriors who vanished without a trace. And so, just like the Knights of Lothric, Drangleik's Dragon Riders were also born out of Faran's new ideology. And now, we can draw a direct parallel between Drangleik and the framework established by Pharosa, where Vendrick represents the warrior caste and Audia represents the sages. Here, it is also worth mentioning that Lothian's axe can be found in Drangleik, on the path to Drangleik Castle. The axe recounts some hearsay about Lothian leaving to kill a dragon, but That same description is very clear that this is just a rumor, and within the context we're living, I'd say that his abandoned dragon slaying weapon is illustrative of how he'd also have given up on dragon hunting. And the Dragon Rider's practices not only mirror Farum himself, but also reflect the Pharosan test of strength described in Vaingard's items, which are now phrased as tests of worthiness, as mentioned by the many Dragon Rider weapons. And the Faran Knights, renowned for their dual-wielding technique, are reminiscent of the Drang Knights who would later move to Irithyll. The Drang Knights are originally from Drangleic, and their armor set is first seen being worn by Welager, Vendrick's Chancellor. In this scenario, Vendrick's lukewarm opinion of clerics is explained by the war gods abandoning Pharosa. He still respected their strength, though, and followed in the example set by Faran in order to attain more power. And just to be clear, I'm not claiming that Vendrick and Lothian are the same. Although that's possible, there is also no evidence to that end, so there's no need for us to assume that. I'm just using Lothian as an example to represent certain concepts and a specific class within Pharosa. Besides his origins, another point of contention in Vendrick's lore regards his rise to power and Welager's dialogue, when he says he vanquished the four Great Ones and built this kingdom upon their souls. The confusion starts when trying to equate these four Great Ones with the Old Ones hunted by the Bearer of the Curse, the Lost Sinner, the Old Iron King, Dux Dear Freya, and the Rotten. It doesn't make sense for Vendrick to have killed them if they're still around. Many people tried to work around this by saying Vendrick had killed previous incarnations of the Old Souls, but I have already repudiated that idea of reincarnation in The Good, the Bad, and the Rotten. Okay, let's say we accept reincarnation just for the sake of argument. Well, that explanation still doesn't make sense. Drangleic is the current kingdom of this land. One of its previous kingdoms was the one ruled by the Iron King. If the Old Iron King currently has the Old King soul, then Vendrick would have killed an incarnation previous to the Iron King. But if Vendrick built his kingdom when he vanquished the four Great Ones, then Drangleic would have to exist both before and after the Iron King's rule. It just doesn't make sense. And again, that's just for the sake of argument, because the reincarnation theory is just a misconception. And also, we killed the Old Ones with a very specific purpose in mind, a purpose Vendrick didn't have. Personally, I think the four Great Ones Welager talks about are the rulers of the four greatest kingdoms that existed here at the time, in a fractured peninsula post-Iron King. This is illustrated in-game by Drangleic's coat of arms, scattered throughout Drangleic Castle and emblazoned on the Shield of Wand, which shows the shields of the kingdoms Vendrick would have assimilated into Drangleic, with a row of four shields at the top that would stand for the four Great Ones. And that last sentence, built this kingdom upon their souls, could be better translated as built this kingdom upon his soul. So Vendrick then unified the land under his rule. This is not only implied by the multi-crest coat of arms, but also by his presence in all the different lands and the presence of those lands in his castle. His forces spread over the coastline, from the Forest of Fallen Giants to the Lost Bastille. His seat of rule stands in the middle of the peninsula, divided between Castle Drangleic and Audia's Keep. He breached the depths of the Undead Crypt, conquered the heights of Dragon Eyrie, and conscripted the remnant forces of the old Iron King, whose domain stretched far into the volcanic region that houses Broom Tower, and whose former captains now boast Drangleic's Dragon Crest. His castle is guarded by alone captains, desert sorcerers, ruin old and primal knights, stone gargoyles, and even an executioner's chariot. Truly a testament to his undisputed conquest. Until, that is, the giants arrived at their shores. It is universally accepted that Vendrick had sailed north to invade the land of giants, and that the giants' incursion into Drangleic was an act of retaliation. It is also common knowledge that he did so under counsel from his queen, Nashandra, and that he brought a prize with him, plundered from the land of giants. Here, the confusion starts when people start talking about the nature of said prize. The three most accepted interpretations I've seen are that the prize was either the giants themselves, their souls, or even the Throne of Want. I personally believe it to be their souls, and, to be honest, I think the game is pretty clear about that. Starting with the Giant Warrior Club, which plainly states that Vendrick, in adherence to Queen Nashandra's counsel, led his armies north in an effort to subjugate the giants and claim their powerful souls for his own. It is worth noting that the Japanese description doesn't say claim their powerful souls, but it does say he went there to defeat the giants that possessed powerful souls, so it isn't as direct as the English version makes it out to be, but the same idea is still heavily implied. And it is also interesting that his obsession with souls isn't presented just through descriptions and dialogues, but also through game mechanics. The King's Shield of Want increases the number of souls acquired, while the Ruler's Sword increases its damage based on the number of souls its wielder possesses. But what purpose drove him to acquire these souls? One application he found for them was to fuel the golems that built his castle, but that wasn't their only purpose. Unlike some people have speculated, Vendrick was neither god nor giant, he was human. And he feared the same thing all undead fear in the world of Dark Souls. He feared Halloween. The King's Ring says he used a powerful soul to keep the curse at bay. Vendrick was obsessed with defeating the curse, and so was Audia for that matter, who sought to overcome the curse through means unlike his siblings. And their race is subtly implied by the human-sized chair where we find his soul as well. And it wasn't just Vendrick himself who profited from the power of these souls. Some of his knights shared in the bounty with him, as the Dragon Rider's armor set says. Aspiring Dragon Riders who had not the mettle to handle their training were torn apart by their worms, and those who survived emerged with deific strength, which I take it to mean Vendrick bestowed upon them the same kind of power that turned him into a giant among men. A king without peers, some would say, but what is a king? In the end, he'd find that he was no king at all. Vendrick withered into a husk of his former self, as he had always feared. Just another mindless hollow wandering the depths of the Undead Crypt. I have broached the topic of his retreat before, but I need to bring it up again, as it plays an important role in this theory and I actually want to expand upon it. So, to understand what drove Vendrick to seek refuge inside the Undead Crypt, first we need to outline his goals. We've already covered that he sought to overcome the Undead Curse and that he used the souls of giants to do so. Now, we also need to establish that this whole endeavor was carried as part of a larger plan designed by Nashandra. Going backward, the end goal is to reach the First Flame, and in order to get there, the king would need access to the Throne of Want. Although it must be said that the throne is an ancient construct built by a long-lost kingdom that predates even the mighty Iron King. It's highly unlikely that either Vendrick or Audia, being originally foreigners to this land on top of it all, would know about its existence, let alone its location. But, judging by Nashandra's painting in Irithyll, found in Dark Souls 3, we can infer that she came from Anor Londo, the same as Gwynevere before her. Nashandra is, therefore, in a much better position to have knowledge of the throne's location and application. Welliger goes even further by stating that the king built the Ringlet Castle for Nashandra. The castle, of course, conveniently standing directly on top of the Throne of Want. It is safe to assume then that she is the one who instructed him to build it there, so they could access the throne, the same way she had already instructed him to sail north in order to gather the souls of giants, in order to make use of said throne. And finally, right at the beginning, at the inception stage of this plan, we'd have her being infatuated with the king's powerful soul, as children of the Abyss are ought to do. Remember that she wasn't born here, she came here, purposefully, or rather with a purpose, that being to find and groom the would-be king through this plan. And I should make a note here, saying that the key item to access the throne is the giant's kinship, or resonance, which is obtained directly from fighting the Giant Lord. If Vendrick meant to sit upon the throne, he would have needed this, just as we do. So, why didn't he bring back this item with him when he plundered the Land of Giants? In regards to his supposed victory over the giants, the Giant Lord so says, after this modest triumph, his countenance could be seen to grow darker with each passing day. So, considering the throne as a goal, and the kinship as a key item, this description seems to indicate that he, Vendrick, knew the consequences of his actions. He couldn't fight and or defeat the Giant Lord in their land, so the plan was to lure the Giant Lord to Drangleic, where Vendrick would have a better chance at vanquishing that lord and acquiring the giant's kinship. Now, to complete this diagram, we need to answer a very important question. Why would a child of the Abyss want her king to link the First Flame? The answer is obviously she wouldn't. But if that's the case, then why go through the trouble of using the Throne of Want to reach the kiln of the First Flame? And this conundrum couldn't be properly solved when Dark Souls 2 came out, but fortunately, Dark Souls 3 gave us the answer. The answer is usurpation. Nashandra, being of the Dark, would naturally have a vested interest in the coming Age of Dark, but the Dark Souls 1 version of how to reach that age is refusing to link the First Flame. It's letting it fade. To do that, one doesn't need to go to the kiln. One only needs to do nothing. But with fire, they say, a true king can harness the curse. If only that king should have the strength to step closer to fire and claim it as his own. Nashandra's dark nature, in conjunction with her obsession with the Throne of Want, and consequently with the First Flame, dictates that she had been grooming Vendrick not to be just a Dark Lord, in line with Dark Souls 1's representation of what that role would be, but that she meant Vendrick to become the Lord of Hollows, as presented by Dark Souls 3's Usurpation of Fire questline. Vendrick's dialogue is even reflected by Urias. And here, yet another question rears its head, that of, why does she fight us then, once we're ready to take the Throne of Want? And, while it's possible that, at the very end, her want may have overcome her, I think she chooses to fight for a very different reason altogether. According to Nashandra herself, a true monarch is much more than a ruler of men. A true monarch carries the weight of their souls. So, while the Champion of Ash is provided with the dark sigils that will allow the usurpation, such sigils didn't yet exist in Dark Souls 2. And since the depths of dark within you grow deeper the more flame you covet, I think Nashandra offered herself in sacrifice, just like Henry does, so that you might become one with the dark. And, taking after Vendrick's philosophy, one must prove worthy of her gift of wedlock. She says it herself, "You've proven yourself to me." Another perspective that helps corroborate this argument is the death cycle. All our deaths are canon. There are in-game mechanics related to them, and NPCs in all installments of the series comment upon the death cycle of the undead. For instance, some recognize they fought us before if we engage them again after being defeated, or Egon's infamy dialogue when we first meet him. So, if you keep getting killed by Nashandra, all of those deaths are being registered. But every time you die, nothing changes. The story doesn't move forward. Her plan makes no progress. The only way to make any kind of progress is by defeating her in a fight that she volunteered herself to. This is your bride. This is your dowry. Thou mayest take thy spouse. Once the king and queen parted ways, he didn't just leave the castle. He buried himself deep underground. And he placed a security system of sorts between him and her, and between her and the Throne of Want. Starting with the Dragon Riders, standing guard right after the room where she stopped her progress. The throne itself is locked behind a King's Gate and is guarded by both Throne Watcher and Defender. To open that gate, one needs the King's Ring, which Vendrick took with him to the Undead Crypt. To reach the crypt, she'd need to open the way to the King's Passage, and the key to the passage is protected from Nashandra by a Milfaniro. A Milfaniro's song is said to grant comfort to those who bear death and dark, such as a Child of the Abyss. It's worth noting that the Milfaniro could possibly do the same to us if she so desired, at least according to their explanation. We knew you were coming and stopped singing. After breaching the passage, the way to the ring is guarded by the Looking Glass Knight, Velstad, and King Vendrick himself. And in the Shrine of Amana, his own soul stands behind a door that only opens for humans, while being guarded by another Dragon Rider. Vendrick refused his role as the Lord of Hollows, but he knew Nashandra wouldn't simply concede on her plans, and he may not have been strong enough to see the path that must be taken. He sees very little these days, but he knew someday somebody might come along who would be. The king favored simple warriors who staked their every battle on strength alone. And so, the plan wasn't just to keep Nashandra out, but also to guide and test warriors who might take his place on the throne of Want. And he went further still, not content in waiting for destiny to grace him with his champion. Vendrick sought to actively conscript undead warriors from faraway lands. It's just as Audia puts it, Vendrick is certain to guide your way. And just as the journey of an undead has always traced the bonfires, so too the Firekeepers would guide the bearer of the curse. There are 3 ways to connect the Firekeepers to both Vendrick and ourselves. The first is by having the Firekeepers guiding our journey every step of the way. Shanalot may have started guiding us in Majula, but we had already been sent to Drangleic by another Firekeeper long before that, by the 4th sister mentioned in Milibeth's dialogue. And remember Strowen's words, "They all end up here, all the ones like you. You spoke to that kind old dear, didn't you?" They indicate this has happened repeatedly over time. Then, after arriving through the portal connecting Drangleic to the outside world, we are immediately greeted by the 3 sisters who make sure we are given an effigy and sent on our way to meet Shanalot, who will proceed to guide us all the way to the throne of Want. The second connection comes from the item Soul Vessel. We know Vendrick acquired the strength of giants, and that he used their powerful souls to become a Goliath. We're never told how, though, but that's extensively what the Soul Vessel does. It allows us to manipulate the power we've acquired from other souls, but to make proper use of this item, some assistance is required. So, I believe that just like us, Vendrick sought guidance from the Firekeepers in order to use Soul Vessels. And the last connection linking Vendrick to Firekeepers comes from the item Sublime Bone Dust. At first glance, Vendrick and the Bone Dust seem unrelated, but it is important to note that all instances of this item, without exception, are kept by royal guards. And these aren't run-of-the-mill soldiers. Their armors were fashioned in honor of Sir Sian, the kingdom's most loyal knight. And, besides the ones protecting Bone Dusts, they have all been posted to places of great importance. They can be found guarding the way to the Undead Crypt and to Vilstad, and they also guard the King's Gate, leading to the memory of Jay and the Giant's kingship. And, as I said, a bunch of them also guard Sublime Bone Dusts. Why though? So, let's start by taking a look at the Bone Dust's description. It says that these are supposedly the remains of a saint who cast himself into the bonfire, but it also immediately casts a veil of doubt on that assertion by saying that we will never know for sure, for Soot and Ashes tell no story. Okay, now, if we look at their set's description, it states that they went thoroughly mad after donning their armors. But the thing is that none of them look mad. They neither act nor fight like hollows as they steadfastly maintain their posts. What then would justify their reputation of madmen? Well, whoever and however they turned to dust, somebody was definitely burned. You put those together, the Mad Knights and the Burning Saints, and the picture that it paints is that the saints didn't cast themselves into the bonfires, but were rather thrown by the royal guards that accompanied them. And taking into consideration the immediacy of not long after that, in not long after they donned their armor, did they go thoroughly mad. Along with the fact that it wasn't an isolated incident but a pattern, the pieces would be indicating that not only they burned the sands, but also that they were ordered to do so. That this was their purpose, given by their king. And note also that they weren't supposedly burned in any old pyre. No, bonfires are specifically mentioned, and the dust itself is used to strengthen Majula's bonfire. So, I don't think these were run-of-the-mill saints either. I think they were firekeepers. Firekeepers would be an important asset to any human-led kingdom in the world of Dark Souls. Important enough that their king might even place knights at their side to guard them, like Morn in the Carving Knights would. And just like any other citizen of said kingdom, the firekeepers would serve their king dutifully. But then, one day, there was Nashandra. Whatever loyalty Vendrick could hope to attain from the firekeepers, their link to the dark would always compel them to be one step closer to the queen. Whether they knew it or not, Nashandra was a child of the Abyss after all, and the queen's deep, dark presence could be felt all throughout Drangleic, as implied by Welliger's dialogue. So, Vendrick had them all killed and replaced them with a firekeeper of his own creation, Shanalot. The Emerald Herald is implied to have been created by Vendrick and Audia as an extension of the crossbreed experiments in one shape or another, since she claims to have been born of dragons and contrived by man. In her glowing purple right eye might be a small physical indication of her nature. When it comes to the theory at hand, besides the points that were already discussed, I'd like to draw attention to the Japanese version of both her name and the word manifestation that she uses in her dialogue. The name Emerald Herald is a bit too cryptic and seemingly without reason at first. Within this context, though, Herald starts to sound a little more appropriate since it means, among other things, an official employed to carry official messages and oversee tournaments, also known as to bear 6 last incoming undead through Vendrick's pilgrimage of trials. This idea is corroborated by her Japanese name, Ryokui no Junrei, where Junrei can mean both pilgrim and pilgrimage, while Ryokui means, well, green. But this isn't the generic Japanese word for green, or even for emerald green, and when it's written in this way, it can be used to reference an ancient imperial rank based on the green kimonos worn by those officials. And she uses the word manifestation to talk about the firekeeper that sent you to Drangleic, the fourth sister, but the word she uses in Japanese, bunshin, is a little more specific than that. Originating in the Chinese word fangshan, this is the name of a Taoist technique that would be used to divide one's body into multiple versions of itself. It can also be found in Buddhism, where Buddha had expressed his wish to use fangshan in order to manifest himself in all worlds, so he could spread the Dharma. So, here, Shanalot is insinuating that the four sisters were created by her, from her. A new host of Drangleic firekeepers eternally loyal to Vendrick and his quest. One interesting and often overlooked aspect of this game is the map beneath Majula's old mansion. I think this map is usually brushed aside as a leftover from the convoluted development process the game went through, but if you know my channel at all, then you already know that I'm here to respectfully disagree. Functionally, the map tracks the player's progress through Vendrick's security system, including the death of the last giant and the acquisition of both the King's Ring and the Ashen Mist Heart. These last two, in particular, indicate that the map is not an ancient device, but something that was created after the foundation of Drangleic. They also indicate that whoever created this device had an intimate knowledge of Vendrick's plans. So, what is this map's purpose and why is it in Majula? Since it monitors Vendrick's system, two options are that it could be to either spy on it or to serve as a backup. Unfortunately, neither option seems to pan out. A spying tool would most likely have been used by Nashandra, but there's no reason for her to have built it here, away from the castle lane herself, where she couldn't gather the information that it provides, and, quite honestly, Nashandra leaves the task of breaking through the system to us, and the task of guiding us to Shanalot. And as for a backup, there doesn't seem to be any secondary systems that would be triggered by it, rendering it useless for that purpose. But there's a third option. The map could have been meant to teach somebody about Vendrick's plan. The map could have been made for us, or for all the ones like us, to be more precise. For starters, the map is connected to the last point I made by having the first instance of a soul vessel being located in the same mansion. And the old mansion is said to be abandoned, but it is fully furnished, filled to the brim with books, and inhabited by Kael. Kael, the cartographer, made the map for Vendrick. This fact is corroborated by Navlan when he says, "Your target will be Kael, the man who's drafting that map." Meaning that Kael has indeed been to Aldia's keep, even though the keep isn't really a place where someone just wanders into. He's more likely to have been there as a guest, back when Aldia and Vendrick were still around. And he may have forgotten what his purpose in Drangleic was, but he's still thoroughly obsessed with this map, going as far as rewarding us for lighting all of its fires, which is to say, going through the gauntlet, proving yourself strong, worthy enough, and gaining access to the Throne of Wands. With all that in mind, I believe Kael was supposed to guide the undead champions along with Shanalot, before the first stages of Halloween started taking their toll, that is. And while we're still in Majula, I'd like to revisit Chloane and her Soul Appease miracle, if I may. I had previously explained why she'd be in possession of this undead crypt miracle, but I see now that just like Kael and Shanalot, so too must these Vogan artisans be here on royal orders, summoned to outfit the undead champions as they embarked on their journey. Chloane, Lenigrast and Mothlin are all connected through their homeland and their collaborative trades. The miracle directly links them to Vendrick's last known location, and the small host of falconers on the path to Drangleic Castle might also be another link in this regard. And finally, hiring foreigners makes sense since Vendrick would have wanted to keep all of this a secret from his queen. And the last piece of this system is, of course, the Giant's Kinship. The bearer of the curse comes across this item in a seemingly arbitrary manner, but the path to it was as planned as any other step we've taken so far. Vendrick left the Ashen Mist Heart for us with this very purpose in mind. The Mist Heart is even tracked by the old mansion map. This could have been made clear from the start since the dragon that gives us the heart was created by Aldia, but since we can use it to access other memories, not just the one leading to the kinship, then it's easy to overlook that aspect. But from all the memories we gain access to, the memory of Jay is the only one protected by a royal guard and, more importantly, the only one locked behind a king's gate. There is nothing else to be guarded here. the king had this gate built specifically for the corpse of the giant that led us to the kingship. So, this is what I have to add to the lore of Vendrick, King of Drangleic. On a surface level, the story presents him as a fairly inconsequential character, just a would-be king who didn't have the mettle to fulfill his destiny, his accomplishments long lost to the sands of time. But I, for one, am pleased that he's much more involved in the plot we play through than the game is initially willing to let out. So now, the greatest question left to answer about Vendrick is, why did he refuse the Throne of Want and the Mantle of Lordship? And the answer, I believe, lies with his brother Aldia, the scholar of the first scene. We have already established Aldia's Phurosan origins, and he may have been initially a sorcerer, but in his quest to overcome the curse, he would become a scholar of all forms of magic to some extent. There is a hexer present in his keep, and they have created the Sunset Staff, which is particularly useful for hexers. The priest's chime says Vendrick kept clerics as attendants to ceremonies, and the presence of one such cleric, stranded in the Dragon Eyrie, suggests that the rituals Aldia devised to reanimate the ancient dragon involved miracles. And his study of chaos is not only exemplified by the Forbidden Sun pyromancy, which was created in Aldian rites, but it also ultimately determined his fate, as his experiments produced a transformation that is akin to Izalith's. Just like the witch, Aldia became something that is unrecognizable from his original form, bearing more similarity to a tree-like entity instead. And he's also shifted completely from soul to fire sorcery, the same kind of power that Izalith and her daughters wielded. And to achieve this result, it would be reasonable to assume that he created something reminiscent of the Chaos Flame. The posterior pieces of evidence for this feat have already been listed, and its origins are all around Aldia's keep. One of the most noticeable aspects of Aldia's research is his obsession with Olafis, the kingdom that Gwynevere had founded in this land. And the keep is the perfect showcase of that. Being functionally portals for black phantoms, the mirrors seem like a derivative technology from the dark chasm of old portals. The torches that summon the Forlorn are the same as the ones that summon the Insolent in the Undead Crypt. And that statue I mentioned in The Good, the Bad and the Rotten, the one I believe might be of Flann, surrounds the keep's main hall. So, first, the Throne of Want is a likely candidate to have initially spurred his research into Olafis. And second, this research enables creating both Shenelot through the Crossbreed experiments, and whatever version of the Chaos/Sinner's Flame Aldia ended up with, which leads to the warped creature that we meet. And again, the torches and the mirrors may also have played a part here, since both could be linked to Aldia's teleportation powers, and since the research that led to the Forlorn, who are associated with the torches in Aldia's keep, caused them to lose their corporeal form and to drift into other worlds, which is very much reminiscent of what happened to Aldia in the end. And speaking of ends, I've been recently asked, why would he attack the player at the throne? I have two answers to that, and I think they are both true at the same time. Lore-wise, I'd say he's testing our worth with a Phurosan-rooted Vendrick-cast trial of might. Non-lore-wise, I'd say he was meant to be a boss-like character, and just like a hunter must hunt, so too a boss must fight. I think they didn't know how to get him in there without having him fight the player. Basic narrative and game design principles demand a satisfying payoff to the introduction of this character to the game, and fighting is the simplest go-to solution for that. Lore-wise, I see no other reason, though admittedly, it was very clumsily implemented, and I should make a note saying that Aurea doesn't test whether we're worthy of the throne, since he already explicitly stated that the throne will certainly receive you, and since we can actually get to the throne without fighting him. What he is truly testing is whether we are worthy of joining him in his quest for an alternative path forward. Looking backward, though, at the period of time preceding his transformation, the item Aurea Key introduces an interesting concept. Its description reads, King Vendrick condemned his own elder brother to dementia. They both sought the truth, but through different means, and their fervor meant the eventual withering of their familial ties. So, Vendrick would have exiled Aurea, but that doesn't translate in-game. On one hand, we have Aurea encouraging you to seek Vendrick's guidance. On the other, we have Vendrick's final plan, making full use of Aurea's research. They both seem to have shared the same vision in the end, since both refused the Throne of Want. And even before that, Aurea was still allowed to continue his research and experiments despite being locked inside the keep. So, I think that just like with Wynne and the Nameless King, Vendrick exiled Aurea for his own protection. Vendrick knew he had to turn away from Lashandra, and he knew he had to protect both his brother and his plan from her prying eyes. The King's Gate, placed at the entrance of the keep, serves as much to keep them in as it does to keep her out. He used the same device for the Throne of Want, after all. And keep in mind that, Aurea being the caster/scholar of the two siblings, everything about Vendrick that is related to magic and or technology is most likely to have come from Aurea, King's Gate included. And now, we finally get to talk about the most relevant aspect of Aurea's research, and arguably of Aurea himself, the study of the first scene. To make better sense of it, we should probably break this down into the subject and the means of his study, as in, what was he studying and how. The first scene is obviously in the past, the distant past for that matter, being the first and all. This facet should make the how pretty clear, I think. They were using the Ashen Mist Heart. The Mist Heart is, in effect, a tool for peering into the past. A tool that is easily connected to Aurea through the Ancient Dragon, who was also created by the Scholar. And yet another link between the Heart and the Scholar can be made through the item Fragrant Branch of Yore, which restores the life of things turned to stone. The Mist Heart is used to access the memories of the Fallen, but its usage in-game is limited to the Giants, the Dragon in Soldora, and King Vendrick. So, what is the through line linking these three? Thinking back to the Age of Ancients, the two most prominent known life forms were the dragons and the Archtrees, and their stone-like scales and bark form a pattern where life forms seemed mineral-based. The giants, with their rock-bound bodies, sharing that similarity, and Vendrick, despite being human, has absorbed the souls of giants. Then, in Aurea's Keep, we have a giant basilisk alongside its petrified victims. So, I believe that Aurea used fragrant branches during experiments with petrification, related not only to the connection that the Ashen Mist Heart taps into, but also to the reanimation of the Ancient Dragon, considering the aforementioned stone-like nature of the dragons and also that Duke Tsoldora was in possession of one such item, acquired as a drop from the Duke or as a reward from Tark, one of his creations. So, this is the how, but what was he studying? Which memories were they peering into? Here, we'd need something that both fits the definition of a first scene from a lore point of view and it being the climax of Audia's research. Also something that narratively fits the climax of Vendrick's arc, since the two characters are intertwined and their rise and fall parallel each other. In this regard, from a narrative perspective, we'd need something that explains why Vendrick turned away from Nashandra and the Throne of Want. To unravel this mystery, the first step is to realize that the definition of a first scene is relative to who's answering that question. If you had asked the gods in ancient Anor Londo, for instance, they might have answered it was Izalith's attempt to recreate the First Flame, which culminated in the Chaos Flame and the war against the demons. From a general population's perspective, in any age, there simply is no first scene. They know nothing of the Ringed City, Menace, the Primordial Serpents, or the Crossbreed experiments. And they know very little about the history of the First Flame, Izalith, and the gods. From their perspective, Undeath and Dark are bad, the gods and the First Flame are good, we need to worship the gods and link the First Flame. But if you ask the goddesses who partook in the Crossbreed experiments, the first scene happened when Gwyn locked away Priscilla, firstborn of the Crossbred. Even Velka would share in that opinion, since that's what finally tipped her over against the ruling gods and spurred her to support the Undead Rebellion. From her, you could also get a deific legal definition of sin as disrespecting the gods or their covenants, as codified in the Book of the Guilty. So, legally speaking, one could make a case that the first sin happened when Gwyn broke his own covenant with the Pygmy Lords and the First Men. But, divinely inspired legal definitions aside, to any human privy to the Ringed City, that really is what a first sin would be, since that's when the gods placed their shackles of bondage upon us. Going further still, one could even argue that the first sin was committed by the Pygmy Lords themselves when they sold out mankind for a crown. But even then, the deal would still remain as the first sin. Audia's definition initially seems to align with the position that Gwyn is responsible for the first sin. He understands that the Lords of Light banished dark and all that stemmed from humanity, and man assumed a fleeting form, meaning we were deprived of our natural state as immortal creatures, being granted life and death instead of perpetual undeath. And he calls the yoke of fate the cycle imposed on us where this supposed curse undoes the illusion of life. That is, our fleeting form. He also states that, although life is brilliant and beautiful, men are shackled by falsehoods and a lie will remain a lie. So, is that it? Did we solve the Scholar of the First Sin's what is the first sin conundrum? Well, not just yet. In his first monologue, he declares that there are but two paths: inherit the order of this world or destroy it. Meaning we can either accept the order of this world and link the First Flame, or destroy the yoke of fate and usher in the Age of Dark. In this scenario, compliant to the most widespread understanding of the lore, the first sin really is a reference to Gwyn's betrayal, and the path to undo such sin is the Age of Dark. But Audia ultimately rejected both paths, in favor of a way beyond the scope of light and beyond the reach of dark. It also must be said that, if this truly were the first sin, then there'd be no reason for the siblings to turn down Nashandra and the path leading to the Lord of Hollows. So, what sin could have justified their betrayal of Nashandra? Well, they had been looking into the memories of the ancient dragon in Tseldora. Note that, unlike the giants, this has nothing to do with our current mission of gaining access to the Throne of Want, yet the choice and the lore are still there. Note also that the siblings did go to Tseldora, as indicated by the fact that parasite spiders drop mastodon weapons, and also by the Royal Army campsite where the Falconer mercenaries, supposedly summoned by Vendrick, stand barricaded outside the city but nowhere to be found inside of it, meaning they're more likely invaders than citizens. And unlike any other memory we visit, the dragon's memories take place in the Age of Ancients. So perhaps the first sin really is something beyond light and dark. Perhaps the first sin is something more primordial. The primordial serpents have always acted from the shadows, advocating toward linking the first flame or to let it fade. Our first and only interaction with them happens in Dark Souls 1 through Frampt and Ka, but their participation in this story begins long before that. Statues of Frampt are clearly displayed in the ancient Ringed City, and they are also implied to have been involved in the war against the ancient dragons, since the armors and weapons of the first man were forged in the abyss, and only the serpents had the power to grant passage into it. In Dark Souls 1, their participation was secretive to a certain point, not revealing themselves until you had reached specific milestones in your quest. Secretive but direct, with Frampt and Kaf speaking face to face with the chosen undead. It is there that they first present themselves as the embodiment of the dichotomy between light and dark, pushing our protagonist to become a champion to either of these forces. But it is later revealed that they were both working together all along when, during the Dark Lord ending of that game, Frampt stands among the other serpents and pledges fealty to the Dark Lord. It has been argued that Frampt changed his mind after you defeated Gwyn, but he learns about the pact you make with Kav before you fight the Lord of Cinder, which would indicate they were already working together before that. Another clear sign of Frampt's lack of loyalty to Anor Londo is that he doesn't turn you away if you kill Gwyndolin. You can offer him Gwyndolin's set in exchange for souls, and Frampt will literally eat the evidence that you murdered the last remaining god of Anor Londo without raising an eyebrow. If he had one, that is. After that, they become more elusive, but their presence could still be inferred. In Dark Souls 2, we have Nashandra as one of the main driving forces in that land. The painting of her that we find in Dark Souls 3's Irithyll implies she moved to Drangleic from Anor Londo, and in Anor Londo, she'd likely have been in direct contact with Frampt, giving her importance and that he was the serpent supposedly aligned with the gods, if not for her nature as a child of the Abyss, which makes her more likely to have been involved with Kav instead. That might seem like a contradiction, until you remember that the serpents are, in fact, working together. And being a child of the Abyss, looking for a future Lord of Hollows, makes it more than likely she was sent to Drangleic by Kav. In that regard, I'd also point to Auria's dialogue, calling the DLC kings monarchs and comparing them to what Vendrick would have become. All that implies a coordinated effort that involved all the Children of the Abyss. Besides Nashandra, there was also Guinevere, and since she also came from Lordran, her involvement with the Serpents is a reasonable assumption, and just like Nashandra, it doesn't really matter to which Serpent she was ultimately aligned with, since they are both working in tandem. The Serpent's participation in Guinevere's endeavor is implied by the Watch Dragon Parma dropped by the dragon standing guard in front of the Cathedral of Blue. This shield grants increased item discovery, just like the Covetous Gold Serpent Ring, and the dragons painted on its face are, obviously, primordial serpents. The shield's description also hints at the nature of the relationship between Frampt, Kaf, and the rest of the world. A shield decorated by intertwined dragons. The black and white contrast depicts the ebb and flow of the fate of all things living, and the serpentine dragons that watch over the march of time. Once we reach Dark Souls 3, the primordial serpents have elected to distance themselves from the process of recruiting champions of light and dark, completely delegating this responsibility to brokers that act in their stead. This allows them to continue manipulating the ebb and flow of fate, while, at the same time, casting a veil that hides their presence from the world even more efficiently than before. Here, Frampt's presence is related to us by the statues at the Grand Archives, which indicate his ongoing participation with the Kingdom of Lothric that supposedly stands as the Bastion of Light, and also by Uria's dying dialogue, which showcases Kaf's ongoing participation with the Kingdom of Londor that stands for the Dark. And I've heard the argument that the serpents are all dead now because of Uria's dialogue, but let's make it clear that the death of a single creature doesn't mean the extinction of its entire race. This is a leap of logic I will not indulge without further evidence. And Dark Souls 3 also provides us with the answer as to why they'd go through the trouble of keeping up this charade to begin with. The answer is, yet again, the usurpation of fire. As per Uria's dialogue, it can be inferred that the usurpation of the First Flame is not only Londor's goal, but Kaf's as well. That falls in line with what we had been presented before. They were looking for a Dark Lord, and now, likewise, they're looking for a Lord of Hollows. And the difference between these two kinds of lords is key to the system at hand. In Dark Souls 3, with the power of the Dark Sigils, the Lord of Hollows usurps the First Flame, that is, wrestles the flame from its mantle, and absorbs it into its own body. None of the old Dark Lords has ever done that, as evidenced by the simple fact that the First Flame still exists. And if that is part of the Serpent's end goal, then the reason behind their scheming is suddenly clear. In Dark Souls 1, they had started their search for a lord that could usurp the flame, but the Dark Lord didn't, so they needed to keep the First Flame alive by linking it over and over again, so they could herd powerful undead into becoming Dark Lords that would eventually usurp it. And then, after every failed Kaf's Dark Lord walks away from the kiln empty-handed, some other of Frampt's undead will eventually burn to link it again. And thus the Yoke of Fate was born, an eternal cycle of linking and fading of the First Flame until the Lord of Hollows can be found. The usurpation ending in Dark Souls 3 also answers the question of which endings were canon in Dark Souls 1 and 2, and the answer is all of them. The thing is that it doesn't really matter what you chose. The cycle will just keep on going regardless. That also means the usurpation is the only true ending in the entirety of the series, since all other Dark Souls 3 endings also comply with the Yoke of Fate. Even the End of Fire, where the Firekeeper wrestles the first flame from its mantle, is shown to be ultimately pointless. First, by her foreshadowing of new champions coming to the kiln as tiny embers. And second, by the subsequent possible ending where you take the flame from her and offers it back to the kiln, putting into practice what she has just foretold. In order to perpetuate this cycle, the gods probably needed very little convincing, since they needed the first flame to survive and to keep the undead at bay. Kav says Gwyn had commanded his children to shepherd the humans, which is what Gwyndolin is doing, but I don't think Gwyn was still working with the serpents at the end. He was escorted by Black Knights to protect the kiln, but if he had instructed his children to send willing kindling, and if he trusted Frampt to do his part, then he wouldn't need to defend the kiln and he wouldn't attack the aforementioned kindling. He'd just let us link the damn flame. That means he must have caught wind of their scheming and needed to protect the first flame from the champions being sent his way because he knew the serpent's ultimate goal was to usurp it. So I think Gwyndolin's plan, disseminated through the prophecy of the chosen undead, is actually just another instance of control from the serpents. Gwyndolин's plan demands that all champions go through the serpents regardless of their allegiance, meaning they will all be offered a chance to become a Dark Lord, and the serpents ultimately hold more control over each individual champion than Gwyndolin does. And it's as I said, Frampt doesn't really care about Gwyndolin. That plan also includes usage of the Lord Vessel, which is usually attributed to Gwyn, but I think this tool was a creation of the Primordial Serpents as well. The vessel is linked to the golden barriers locking Izalith, Needle and Thief away, and I don't think Gwyn instituted those barriers, primarily because of Sif the Scaleless. The dragon has been dubbed insane and a traitor, but we know now that the madness associated with his experiments was, more likely than not, a misinterpretation by those who weren't privy to the nature of the crossbreed experiments. And, in all honesty, if Sif had become any kind of a threat prior to Gwyn's departure, he'd have lightning bolted his scaleless ass back to the Age of Ancients, faster than you can say praise the motherfucking sun. Farmer confident or not, Gwyn would have no qualms in putting down an out-of-control ancient dragon living next door to Anor Londo. But if Gwyndolin was an infant left under Sif's care when Gwyn departed, which I think is very much likely, then Frampt would be motivated to brand Sif as a traitor, so he could better manipulate the youngling god. And locking away Needle and Izalith prevents them from becoming a threat in the absence of the Lord of Sunlight. And yet, another aspect of the Lord Vessel that wouldn't make sense if it had been created by Gwyn is that it requires the killing of the Four Kings. Why would he lay down a path leading into the abyss, knowing that none of his kinsmen would have access to it, and, perhaps more importantly, knowing what lurked within? But that does make sense if we consider the serpents, since it gets rid of a set of failed prospect Dark Lords, the Four Kings, and mandates the chosen undead to meet with Kav, granting them the opportunity to indoctrinate the champion. And so, after all this, I hope it's become clear that, among all other candidates, the serpents are the ones with the greatest likelihood of being the creators of this vessel. They are the ones guiding us in its usage, after all. When it comes to the undead, besides the points that I have listed just now, they also eventually guided them to found their own kingdom of Londor. And one last tool that needs mentioning are the bonfires. The journey of an undead has always traced the bonfires. They have always guided the undead, and that can be observed in-game, since we are always following the bonfires and we always end up in the kiln of the first flame. The coiled sword inside the bonfire is reminiscent of the recurring intertwined serpent symbology, and it's imperative to note that there's a bonfire inside the abyss. Who would have placed a bonfire inside the abyss, back when it was nothing but endless void, if not the primordial serpents? Also, since the Lord Vessel affects the bonfires directly, then if they created one, that kinda makes it more likely that they'd have created the other as well. And other than that Abyss bonfire, there are two other instances that are particularly interesting. The one leading to the Drag Heap, and the one in Dark Souls 3's Firelink Shrine, the one that takes us to the kiln of the first flame. The one leading us to the Drag Heap is located inside the Painted World, which is currently under Frida's control, and not only is she from Londor and supposed to have been instrumental in the Serpent's plan of usurpation, but the bonfire itself has been placed in front of a statue made to look like a serpent. Now, since the bonfires are fast travel instruments for the undead, then that one functionally works as a backdoor to the Ringed City, allowing the undead to get there via an inconspicuous route. And the one in Firelink Shrine is interesting simply because it leads us to the feet of the kiln in the far distant future. They had to prepare the throne ritual to link both points in time, from the moment of that ritual's creation to when the kiln bursts out of the ground. I mean, sure, that makes sense in hindsight, if you're looking at it from the future, but what about when the ritual was being created? They had to have planned that beforehand. They had to have known, in the present, that they'd need to transport us to the far, far, far distant future. That is an absurd display of foresight, if I may say so myself. And just one last, very important note here. For those who might still disagree with my theory that Rosaria was the Queen of Lothric, working with Londor all along, and that's if Lothric's Throne Ritual was intended to link the First Flame, so the Age of Fire could be perpetuated, then the Throne Ritual wouldn't take us to the future. It would take us to the kiln in the present, so we could link the flame here and now, resetting the cycle for the inhabitants of Lothric today, instead of resetting it for the dilapidated Lothric found in the Drag Heap. And even though all these arguments combined show us how they're guiding us toward usurpation, they don't really tell us why, do they? In Dark Souls, the two faces of the Eternal War, the two fates you can choose from, are the Age of Fire and the Age of Dark. Usurpation leads to the Age of Dark, and that is the Age of Man. For Dark itself is the realm of mankind, is it not? Well, who told you that? Was it maybe the Toothy Serpent, Kaf? The foremost manifestation of Dark that can be found in this world is undoubtedly the Abyss. If Dark were the dominion of man, then it would stand to reason that the Abyss would be its domain. But think back to our first brush with the Abyss. In our first playthrough, many of us jumped into the Dark Chasm and found nothing but death. Despite being human, we had no right of entry into the Abyss. We, humans, were not allowed into the Dark Kingdom, but the serpents were already there. Only through the blessing of their covenant could men cross that threshold and find not only that the serpents lived in the dark, but were also one with it, moving about freely through the void within and taking us from one dark corner to another like a plaything. The abyss is their realm, not ours. The dark is their domain. And whatever Kaf may have told us, the coming age of dark has indeed already come and gone. The dark age of man ended in the lifeless grey desert of the dying pygmy lords. Unlike many people have come to believe, Filianor wasn't holding back time for the Ringed City, nor was the city an illusion. This is made obvious by the fact that, unlike Anor skies, the Ringed City itself remains in its state even after we've woken Filianor up. Filianor was an illusion, but the city is not, and shattering that illusion doesn't suddenly thrust the Ringed City into the future. It doesn't allow time to catch up with the city or vice versa, which is, again, made very clear by the fact that the city remains there in its pre-existing state, even without Filianor. The only thing moving through time is the player, just like when we visited Ulasil. And make no mistake, the distant future where we fight Gale for the blood of the Dark Soul isn't just in a different time, it's become a different world. Divested of both the first flame and the dark, this barren wasteland is akin to the age of ancients made anew. Have you ever stopped to really look at Filianor's dead body, to contemplate the grandeur of this picture, and to take in the ramifications of this fact? When, in all of Dark Souls, have you ever seen the dead body of a god before? The first flame is, for the first time since its creation, truly gone. And likewise, Aldrich's coming age of the deep sea and the abyssal swamp of the locust preachers, they have all withered like the pygmy lord's blood. Remember that the usurpation of fire is the only ending capable of breaking the cycle of linking and fading. That is the only path leading to this brave new world. Someday, somebody became the true Lord of Hollows and ushered in the fabled Age of Dark, but just like the Age of Fire, it too must have come to an end. Dark is not our dominion. The Age of Dark is not our endgame. And to go into more detail about the Dark, I'd like to expand on the theory I proposed in The Good, the Bad and the Rotten that connected Sif's primordial crystal to the Dark. And I'm predicting this is going to be controversial, so I'm leaving a timestamped link in the description to make it easy for you to go back and review the details of that particular theory. Now, if I'm right about that bit, and I really think I am, then one very consequential detail must be addressed here. According to Big Hat Logan, Sif pillaged the primordial crystal from the ancient dragons, which means that, more likely than not, the primordial crystal predates the first flame. But if the crystal contained dark inside of it, then that means dark itself predates the first flame as well. And believe me, I know this goes against everything most people believe about the relationship between the first flame and the dark, but everything points to the primordial crystal having dark inside of it, and this is, in turn, just the logical conclusion to that fact. And that's not all. I haven't seen any hard theories one way or another, but I think most people take the first flame to have been a natural occurrence, something that spontaneously came into being. I'm now going to disagree with that as well. First, that goes against a pattern that is established by the games. Going backward, someone created the Profaned Flame, someone created the Sinner's Flame, someone created the Chaos Flame, and, likewise, someone would have created the first flame as well. Now, one last detail to keep in mind before the next mind-boggling statement is that the lore implies that Dark houses a black flame of its own at its core. Looking at Dark Souls 3's Black Flame Pyromancy, it quite blatantly says that the black flames are said to be the impenetrable fires of humanity. Humanity being, in the world of Dark Souls, the dark men hold within themselves. Even more still, Dark Souls 1 and 3 describe these flames as being both weighty and bearing no shadow, which are characteristics usually associated with things of the dark and unkindled hollows respectively. And this goes in tandem with Kornik's words saying that an untouchable flame resides in the depths of man, to indicate, once again, that the dark has, at its core, a black flame of its own. So, in the intro to Dark Souls 1, we are shown the proto-gods born in the dark appearing in the kiln of the first flame. It was previously believed that the flame had created the dark in that place, but if the dark already existed, then the first flame appeared on top of the dark. Now, if you have the first flame appearing above the dark, which has a flame of its own, and if they are ultimately united as one within the vessel that is the Lord of Hollows, then it wouldn't be such a leap to assume that the first flame was actually born from the dark, just like the creatures who would assimilate the souls found inside the kiln. And considering what I said before, that there is an in-game pattern where these flames are all created by someone, and also that the dark is more closely related to the primordial serpents than to man, then that makes them, the serpents, the most likely candidates to have created the first flame. Remember that the serpents have no clear origin. It is never clearly stated whether they came to be before or after the first flame. But if we take the time to consider everything that was said thus far, then it becomes apparent what the game is indicating. That they are at least as ancient as the dragons, and that they created the first flame from the dark. When you think about it, the first application of the first flame was to create an army to fell the everlasting dragons. Certainly, something in line with what the primordial serpents may have wanted, is it not? Again, I'm aware this is probably going to be controversial. I know it feels counterintuitive, but in all honesty, this is just the next logical step to everything I've laid out so far. Either way, let's take a moment to try and cement this idea before moving on. And to do that, I need to make a side note explaining a different theory that fits into this concept. It goes like this. When thinking about Izalith, one of the first things that come to mind are pyromancies, and beside a few quirks, regular pyromancies are nearly indistinguishable from the fire sorcery that she wielded in the Age of Ancients. But between fire sorcery and pyromancy, there lies chaos, and the key discernible feature of chaos pyromancies is molten lava. As we have already established, life forms in the Age of Ancients were characterized by mineral-like attributes, and the Chaos Flame has imparted the same attributes. The indications of this are very clear. First, through the aforementioned molten lava, and second, through the demons themselves, with the most flagrant example being the Stray Demon, who turns to stone after the chaos inside of it has exhausted. Even its pyromancy now produces a boulder instead of fire. So I think the Chaos Flame was an attempt to create a power source that could draw from the primordial energies of the Age of Ancients, bypassing the first flame that created her Lord Soul. Also, the giant trees of Lost Izalith, the bed of chaos plant-like appearance, and the bark-like hide of some demons seem to denote that the Chaos Flame tapped into the nature of the Archtrees as well, which makes sense within this context since Archtrees were one of the two prevalent life forms of that age. As I stated in the Crossbreed Experiments video, the dark sign being used to contain the undead is akin to Vendrick's dialogue when he talks about using fire to harness the curse. And since it is made of fire instead of lightning, then it is more likely to have been created by Izalith rather than Gwyn. And lastly, I think this idea of fire harnessing the curse is kind of what Izalith had in mind when she later created the Chaos Flame. Remember that the Izalith staff associates Izalith to the dark by saying that the staff seems to boost the power of dark sorceries. But I think that a more relevant connection can be made through Dark Souls 1's chaos weapons, such as Kelag's Fury Sword, which is forged from her soul and, quite interestingly, scales with humanity, just like the Abyss Greatsword. This feature of chaos seems absent in Dark Souls 3, but I don't think it is. Even if chaos had lost this characteristic, there'd be no reason for it to be reflected in the Abyss Greatsword after all. They both still scale with humanity, but being unkindled, we have no humanity left for them to scale with. So let's review. A pattern has been defined where chaos draws from ancient forms of energy. This process manifests itself outwardly by having chaos mirror both the ancient dragons and the Archtrees. But chaos is also drawing from the dark in the form of humanities, or harnessing the curse, if you will, that places the dark within that same pattern, indicating that the dark is, in fact, a primordial form of energy that would predate the first flame. And I think dark was also an active ingredient of this process. I think we can infer how it was used. There is one particular way in which the dark is described by the game that interests me in this context. Let's start by looking at the Miracle Gnaw that summons an insect swarm to tear open the skin and burrow into the flesh. These insects are also referenced by Irina's dialogue, when she says, "The dark surrounds me, nibbles at my flesh. Little creatures, they never stop biting. I am frightened of the dark that gnaws away at me." And by Pontiff Knight weapons that appear to be eaten away by insects. One thing I find interesting here is how this imagery of the dark as a swarm of insects is evocative of the description in Anastasia's Soul, which reads, "Held within their bosoms, below just a thin layer of skin, are swarms of humanity that writhe and squirm." And I also find interesting the appearance that those Pontiff Knight weapons have acquired. They look eroded, as if doused in acid of some kind. This equivalence between eating away and erosion comes up again in other instances. For example, Dark Souls 2's Toxic Mist and Dark Fog both have poison-like symptoms and are described as eroding the body and eating away at the inner essence respectively. Dark Fog is a hex that is dark in nature, and even though Poison and Toxic Mist aren't dark pyromancies, in Dark Souls 1 and 3, the mists themselves are purple, a color strictly associated with dark spells. And just like Gnaw is a dark miracle that, well, gnaws at the flesh, Pestilent Mist is a seemingly dark sorcery that eats away at HP, So, the dark has an effect akin to solvents and acids. And pyromancies even take this one step further with the very illustrative Acid Surge spell. So I think this is exactly the application that Dark had in creating the Chaos Flame. It was used as a kind of solvent to break down the soul into components that could be sorted out, allowing them to exclude the parts drawing directly from the first flame, creating a new kind of soul that maintains some of its original features while being fueled by more ancient types of energy instead. And if you allow me the indiscretion, I'm going to harp on this concept of dark as a solvent by bringing an outside reference into the discussion, with the usual caveat that no outside reference can be taken as canon, of course. It's a quick one from Bloodborne to showcase an inter-IP motif that would support this concept. There, blood is used in a symbolic manner similar to the dark, and, according to Bloodborne, when all is melted in blood, all is reborn. And keep in mind that the transformation Aurea went through and this theory complement each other, creating a more clear picture for you to consider later on. Now then, back to the main theory, shall we? The last subject left to delve into regards what would be the goal of the primordial serpents. For all their scheming, it's become clear that they have no interest in the future of neither gods nor men. But what is it then they truly want? Another widespread concept I believe to be false is that they yearn to become dragons. That idea is born from the descriptions the serpent is an imperfect dragon and a snake that could have been but never was a dragon. But that never made much sense to me. They have seen and possibly orchestrated the fall of the ancient dragons. And even if they didn't, why would they covet to become that which has already fallen? The greed to which they're associated and just sheer logic would dictate that they'd aim to become something more than that. To me, could have been but never was a dragon says they had the power to be like dragons, to supplant them in the order of this world, but that they chose not to. They chose to pursue a higher path, a path leading to more power than the dragons of old could ever have hoped to amass. In the beginning, the world was unchanging and unformed, but then there was fire, and disparity ripped apart the unity of this world. Everything that was ancient slowly replaced by a new world, everything stretched between light and dark, everything tethered to either the first flame or the abyss. They gave this world, our world, all of its life and energy in all of its splendor, and lost in all of our own existence, we failed to see the toll that was being collected. After that singular moment of creation, they started reclaiming that which they had given us. We continued offering our souls in the altar of the first flame, and the flame consumed it all. We offered our humanities to the bonfires, and our kingdoms to the children of the abyss. And with every ounce taken back from us, they took a little bit of this world along with it. Enough to give form to the abyss, enough to bring the soul of Cinder to life, enough to make their endless hunger swirl and swallow everything whole. It started small, as such things often do, but its force would grow to one day drag the world into the first flame, unearthing far-off kingdoms and their thrones, casting them all into a drag heap as they pile on top of each other, like the big pieces of rubbish they've always been. Disparity will feast upon this world and leave it dry, and all that it has consumed, all of the light and all of the dark, they would find a new home in the Lord of Hollows. All that ever was, safely stored in a single vessel to be used by those who have sent us. For millennia, we were so busy fighting each other, we never stopped to consider what dangers might be prowling in the shadows. The serpents took everything. Nothing like some good old-fashioned greed, eh? For those left behind, there's nothing but grey deserts and throneless lords. But what about them? What could they even need to steal a world's worth for? The Serpent's plan is twofold. On one hand, there's the plundering of all the resources of this world, and on the other, there's an escape plan. The bonfires are tools of the primordial serpents that guide the undead. The Painted World is under Frida's control, and there's a Londor pilgrim on the other side of the bonfire that leads you from the painting to the drag heap. A Londor pilgrim pointing you in the direction of the Ringed City. You put all that together, and the conclusion is that going to the Ringed City was also a part of the Serpent's plan. They had already reclaimed everything else. The Dark Soul was the only thing left to pillage. The goal of our foray into the Ringed City is, ultimately, to acquire the blood of the Dark Soul, which is, in turn, used to create a new Painted World. Therefore, a new Painted World is a part of their plan as well, a cold and dark world of their own. And what of the Lord of Hollows, you might ask? Well, if they wish to ascend to something greater, devouring the Lord of Hollows, who is essentially the vessel for a whole world, should be enough for their wildest dreams. Now, there's a second, non-canonical theory inside this theory. The serpents consumed everything and left to a new world. So, what if they just keep doing that? What if they repeat that process in this new world? What if they had already done that before? A temporal and dimensional locust plague moving from age to age and from world to world, consuming what they need to fuel their evolution. Possibly starting with Demon Soul's Old One falling in and out of a deep slumber and the world-consuming fog. Then the serpents, the first flame in the abyss, later becoming actual dragons and showing up as the Divine Dragon, sapping the magic out of the divine waters. And possibly, in the last stop, Bloodborne's Great Ones falling back into a deep sleep and ascending to new planes of existence. A parasitic, ever-evolving species that cannot be stopped and leaves nothing but wrecked worlds in its wake. Also, in this side theory, the proto-gods that appeared around the first flame may be soulless husks from the world where Boletaria existed, but I need to play Demon Souls first, so I can make more sense of that. Well, that's that, I guess. And I told you there'd be a lot of stuff in there. There's a lot of information, a lot to unpack, and I guess a lot of it's kind of controversial, so leave me a comment if you like. And I'll keep this one short. I just would like to thank you all for watching it. If you made it this far, congratulations on your stamina. Thank you to all my patrons, as always, Vinny, John, Ethan, and Sinclair. I think this was the last big topic I had to cover, but there's still some stuff that I want to talk about in future videos. If you'd like to suggest anything or ask me questions, just go ahead. And yeah, see you around.